Let's create the three databases that we need for the budget and expense tracking. First, create the yearly budget database. Then let's create the monthly budget database. Finally, let's create the expense tracker database. These are the three databases that we need for our budget and expense tracking, but we shall create one more database. If you remember, in the first video we talked about survival amount, and this fourth database is going to help us to keep track of that, but that's something we will discuss later in the video. Let's first create the required columns that we need for those three databases. In the first video, we talked about expense head, expense frequency, budgeted amount, actuals. But now is the time to create all the columns for each of the database. And to save some time, I have already created the list of columns and the property type of those columns and the purpose of those columns for all three databases. If you want, you can download the copy of this database column list for reference. Link is in the description. So let's create all these columns for these databases. First, we will start with yearly budget database. So first column is expense head. This is the default column. Next, we'll create the year column, and the property type of that column is number, and the purpose of this column is to keep track of the budget year. Next few columns are marked in yellow, and the property type of all these column is going to be formula. And for now, we'll just create the column with formula type, but we will not write any formula now. We'll create those formulas later. So let's start with yearly budget column. Then we shall create actual till date. Let me create the rest of the yellow color columns. Okay, so we have now created all the formula columns. The property type is number for the next set of yearly budget database columns. Now let's create these columns which are having the property type as number. So first create this monthly budget database portion. Next, create number of months. Again, the property type is number. Okay, so let me create the other columns as well. Let's talk a bit about this column display order. This is again marked as optional, and it will help us to control the display order. We did something similar in habit tracking database. The property type of this column is going to be number. Now the columns that you see here in this green color, this is again optional, but I highly recommend to create all these columns every time you create a new Notion database. So let me create these columns quickly. Okay, so we have now created all the columns for yearly budget database, as you can see here. Let's now go back to that Excel and check the columns for monthly budget database. Let's create these columns in monthly budget database. Again, I have mentioned all the column names that we need for monthly budget database and the property type of all these columns and the purpose of these columns, why we need it. So let's create expense head first. So we'll just rename this to expense head. Then we need expense frequency. Type will be select and the options would be monthly, quarterly, yearly. Again, next few columns are having type formula. We'll just create this column now. We'll not write any formulas now. So let's quickly create the columns. And we will have one column for actual survival amount tracking in the monthly budget database, and the type of this column would be again formula. We will have this month and year column as type date. So it will be in date. Again, two more formula columns, month and year. Let's create this ad hoc forecast override column. We also have display order for monthly budget database as well. Now those columns that I always recommend to create in the Notion database. Let's create those quickly. Okay, so we now have created all the columns for our monthly budget database, as you can see here. Now let's create the columns that we need for expense tracker database. Again, these are the list of columns. This is the type of those column and the purpose. First column is that default database column, and we'll call it expense type. Now the next column, expense category, we'll be using a separate database and link that database to this column. So this is something we'll come back later. So let's create the other columns first. Expense amount is number. Next is survival amount percentage. We talked about this in the first video. Type will be number, and for this survival amount percent, we will edit the property and change the number format to percent, because we want to see this value in percentage. Then we will have survival amount, which is a formula type property. Then we have expense month and year as date. Then we'll create a new column, notes, with property type text. This is just to capture any comment or any remarks for any of the expense type. Then our usual recommended columns. Let me create those. Okay, so we have now created the columns for expense tracker database, except this expense category column, which will come back later. We shall create that fourth database that we mentioned earlier for expense category. Now this is not a mandatory database that we need to create. This is entirely optional. We can even use the database column type select for expense categorization, but using the database has certain advantages, and we will discuss about that in future video when we will have some data loaded into our databases, and I will show you how using the database can help us in many scenarios. Now let's go to Notion and create that optional expense category database. So let's create a new database for expense category. We'll call it expense category database. Now again, I have mentioned the columns here in this list. So we'll use the default column as category name, which is basically the expense category name, and the other columns are only those recommended columns. So let me quickly create those. So we have now created the optional expense category database as well. We'll use the record of this expense category database and link that to this column in monthly database, which is expense category database. And we will do that by linking both the databases. And that's something we'll cover in the next video. That's all the required columns and database that we need for our budget and expense tracking. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.